So I've been on a real nostalgia trip lately. That has involved going back and revisiting some of the things that I really adored when I was growing up in the 80s. Luke and Laura from ABC's General Hospital. For people who weren't around during the height of the fame for these characters, it's going to be a really hard thing to describe. Soaps really don't have the domination of afternoon TV that they did when I was growing up. It's very hard to convey to people who didn't live through this how phenomenally popular Luke and Laura were. These were very popular young lovers from the TV show, easily defined as soap opera's first supercouple, which became a really popular feature of a lot of soap operas through the 80s. But this was a phenomenon that really extended past soap opera. The popularity of these characters and their storyline broke out into the mainstream. Most notably, they made the cover of Newsweek. But if you were anywhere near a supermarket checkout aisle in the late 70s or early 80s, you were definitely well familiar with what these characters looked like, even if you didn't watch the show. People who normally would never have watched soaps became addicted to this couple and the show General Hospital. It had a very red-hot streak, lightning in a bottle. Like many people, I absolutely fell in love with Luke and Laura and the two actors that played them, Anthony Geary and Genie Francis. So remembering the Luke and Laura phenomenon and how much I loved it when I was growing up, it made me really nostalgic to go back and revisit it. What happened? What was going on? Why did they do this storyline? How did they pull it off? How did they get away with it? I don't think that the 30 million viewers who tuned in for the wedding of these characters were all people who thought that rape was romantic. I think that they were able to kind of separate out that early storyline from what they came to embrace about the character. If you are a fan of these characters, so many great clips on YouTube. The one that I relied on the most was a channel called Susie Q. This channel is amazing. What Susie Q did was to go through years of General Hospital episodes, editing in just the scenes that pertain to Luke and Laura, putting them all in a continuous chronological playlist, so you can essentially watch this story from start to finish. I couldn't believe what a gold mine this channel was. It was amazing. It took me a hot minute to get through all that. I've really kind of been lost in Luke and Laura land. So to set the stage for where General Hospital was when Luke and Laura blew up, General Hospital, which happens to be at this point ABC's longest running television program, as well as, really sadly, the only remaining soap opera left on the network. General Hospital first aired in 1963. As per the title, it was really intended to be sort of confined to the goings-on of this hospital. The early storylines really centered on the staff. The primary characters of the show initially were doctors, nurses, hospital staff. The hospital itself was kind of used as a hub where all the different storylines sprang from. It's a setting that's pretty rife for drama. It was very much what we might call a kitchen sink drama. There's no location shots, very, very simple set. I was surprised in watching some of these scenes how many of them the set was just a desk in an empty room with really tight shots up close on the two actors to kind of hide. There really wasn't a lot else on the set there. So it was a lot of these kind of scenes of, people sitting around drinking coffee, shots that have no background extras, and almost filmed in a way where it's almost like watching live theater or watching a play, very kind of almost intimate with the actors. But the tone of the show was drastically different from what it eventually morphed into. That kind of stilted melodrama. The things that people kind of make fun of when they're talking about soaps sometimes, like, I think my husband's having an affair. Unfortunately, it was also at a point where it had really plummeted in the ratings. And so at that point, the network was on the verge of pulling the plug. They decided to try to give it a last chance and a shot in the arm by bringing in a new executive producer named Gloria Monty. Gloria Monty went on to become an absolute legend in the soap world. She's actually the basis for the fictional soap producer on the show that Dustin Hoffman's character works on in Tootsie. Fierce but motherly, who rules the rose with an iron fist. Some said that she was brought on by the network and given 13 weeks to try to save the show. Now, in her own words in some interviews, she actually said that she was brought in because they knew they were going to cancel the show. They just wanted to improve it just enough before it was canceled so that it could kind of sail off into the sunset with dignity. It's really crazy to think that it was doing that poorly. One thing I really love about those years of General Hospital, like late 70s to early 80s, is also just how seamlessly it kind of shifted genres. A lot of these things did become staples over the 80s, some of these kind of fantasy, sci-fi, action-adventure storylines. 1 minute, very angsty melodrama. The next, it's kind of a screwball comedy. Then it kind of delves into the sort of James Bond territory. And it did it all really seamlessly. Going back and rewatching it, I was really surprised with how naturally it all kind of evolved, where I didn't feel like I was getting whiplash from these sudden shifts or that it seemed inconsistent. It really just kind of had this magic mojo where it could kind of throw everything at the wall and make it work. So when we look at where Gloria Monty entered the scene here, she had this show that was really flagging, really failing. It wasn't very visually appealing. It wasn't very exciting. Gloria Monty was determined to change all, to take that and turn it on its head. She wanted to completely revitalize it. Some of the things that she did right away were to improve the set. She brought in a Broadway set designer to give it a more contemporary, modern feel. She employed a lot of primetime techniques, which weren't a common thing in daytime at that point. She also picked up the pacing, so it doubled the amount of scenes. And one of the things that really jumped out at her was that there was a real dearth of younger characters. The adults were the focus of the show. She felt like part of why daytime audiences were diminishing. The medium hadn't revised itself for a new target audience. With more women in the workplace, the soap audience had changed a little bit. Traditionally, there was always kind of that stereotype of the housewife watching soaps. But of course, I mean, soap operas in general began as kind of long advertisements for soap products for Procter & Gamble. And what Gloria Monty thought at that time was that they were really ignoring their new potential target audience, which was young people, teenagers, college students. She felt that this was a really neglected demographic that really had the potential to become a huge audience. One of the things that she wanted to do was to bring young characters in, follow the example of other soaps like All My Children. So when she was looking at the available cast members at that time to maybe focus a little bit more on, she really became interested in a character named Laura Weber. Laura at that time was played by a 15-year-old actress named Genie Francis. Getting cast on General Hospital was only Genie's second acting job. Prior to that, she had had a guest appearance as a kind of bratty little skateboarder girl on an episode of Family. She was the daughter of renowned actor Ivor Francis, and she wasn't the original Laura either. She was a recast. The original Laura had been a little bit younger. Her storyline had been that one of the primary characters on the show, Dr. Leslie Weber, learned that the daughter that she believed had died in childbirth was actually alive, being raised by another family in one of those kind of switched at birth sort of storylines. She reunited with her daughter, briefly was trying to get custody of Laura. However, upon realizing how stressful the situation was, Leslie decided to make the sacrifice of returning Laura to the family that had raised her. So young Laura, who was really more of a kid character at that time, was off the canvas for a while, and then reintroduced, played by Genie. She had experienced a little bit of what they call soap opera rapid aging syndrome, and so in the storyline that Laura returned in, she had run away from home to join a cult and was living in a commune. So when Leslie found out, she rescued her, brought her back home to live with her. And this really kind of set the stage for young Laura's storylines. Originally, once Laura was returned with Leslie, she was really more of a secondary character. However, Gloria Monty really set her sights on enhancing Laura's character and making her a primary focus of the show. I really feel like Genie Francis is a little bit underrated as an actress. It's really hard to believe that she was as young as she was when she played this character. The writers really put her through her paces. Laura went through a lot in a few years. Genie was really given some pretty heavy and challenging material for an actress her age. I felt like in a lot of ways watching this, what I was really watching was the story of Laura growing up and maturing. I think that there was something kind of universal about the struggles she was going through. So when Gloria Monty decided to push Laura to the forefront, one of Laura's first big storylines involved her being seduced by an older man who was a friend of her parents. Laura's a young teenager at this time. This is a grown adult. She accidentally murders the man who seduced her, David Hamilton, and then flees the scene. When the story hits the press, Laura's publicly shamed and becomes the talk of the town. So she struggles a lot with being the subject of negative attention, victim blamed and shamed. So in Laura's next big epoch, she gets married at 17 to law student Scotty Baldwin. The people around her don't necessarily have a lot of faith in her maturity and her judgment. She's really struggling to prove herself as an adult. All the people in her social circle are a little bit older than her. Listening to interviews with Genie Francis of what she was going through at that time, I think in a lot of ways that mirrored the experience that she was having. Being one of the youngest people on the set, being around all adults and not really feeling like she fit in, was something that she was really struggling with behind the scenes as well. And I think a lot of that comes out in Laura. So at this time is when the show introduced a character named Luke Spencer. Luke initially came in as kind of a side character, kind of a small day player, comic relief type character. His original arc was intended to be 13 weeks. He was brought in by Gloria Monty, who had worked with the actor Tony Geary before. When she invited him to come and do this role in General Hospital, his first response to her was, "I hate soap operas." And she said to him, "So do I. We're going to change him. We're going to shake everything up." Tony Geary at that time was an actor who was working steadily in television. He was one of kind of the consistent staples of the Quinn Martin production shows. And so he was a familiar face to audiences. He had also done some previous soap work before. Often cast as characters who were a little off-kilter, a little weird, a little off the beaten track, and he was very good at it. I think probably a lot of people when casting him saw him as more of a supporting actor than a leading man type. Everything about him that would have made him not seem like leading man material was really what charmed audiences. He was kind of the heartthrob that soap watching audiences didn't know they needed. So the initial incarnation of Luke was really kind of this shady, ne'er-do-well, minor character. He was brought on as the brother of Nurse Bobby Spencer, played by the amazing late, great Jackie Zeman. Nurse Bobby at that time was a young nurse who had a background of being from the wrong side of the tracks, which, just as a side note, like, soap opera characters from the wrong side of the tracks were kind of a really popular trope at that time. You know, they could be kind of an interesting juxtaposition against some of the snooty, wealthy characters. And so part of Nurse Bobby's background was that she was a former prostitute. She had had a hard scrabble childhood, now trying to leave her past behind and reinvent herself as a nurse. But she's a schemer, although she mellowed a lot over her decades on the show. The early incarnation of Bobby was, she had a devious streak. She hated Laura. Laura was her mortal enemy at that time because Bobby had her sights set on Laura's then boyfriend Scotty. So in an attempt to break them up, she called in a favor from her older brother Luke. In the very first scene that we see of Luke, he's this kind of shady, ne'er-do-well type. But basically she wants to try to break Laura and Scotty up, and so she has some ideas for some like pranks and schemes to get in the way between the two of them. He's always down to be up to no good, so she asked him to help her out with her scheme. They set out on a series of schemes to try to drive a wedge between Scotty and Laura. They all fail. And an ironic plot twist, when Luke does meet Laura for the first time, he is absolutely smitten with her, blown
Ready
away,
to get your 15
absolutely
and
sprung.
then springs back up.
She's fairly
This is thanks to
oblivious to
elastic
that.
push.
So this begins a turning point in this story. So at this point, both Luke and Laura are attending the same college. Luke takes this opportunity to befriend Laura, who is in a lot of ways kind of ripe for the picking. Laura has an inner loneliness. She's misunderstood by the people in her life. So Teddy Geary was in his early 30s compared to Genie still being a teenager when he was first cast. But I don't think at that time Luke was supposed to be in his early 30s. Just judging from context and the fact that he was more youthful looking, my guess is that at that point Luke is probably supposed to be maybe early to mid-20s top. They have a big story where they go back and retcon some aspects of his childhood. It makes Luke the same age as his actual portrayer, Tony. So if that were the case, then Luke was supposed to be in his 30s, which I just don't really think he was. I don't really think that was the original intent with the character. I think he was supposed to be in his 20s. But anyway, friendship develops between the two of them. Tony Geary is really good at kind of showing this obsession that Luke is gaining with Laura. He plays it off around her. She's not aware of it. But we see that there's something a little creepy about this. In this early incarnation of Luke, what really drives the character initially is his desire to prove himself to people. Luke comes from this incredibly tragic, hard scrabble childhood from the wrong side of the tracks, very aware of the disconnect between the haves and the have-nots. And his greatest desire is to be somebody, to become one of the elite, to make money, to become respected in society. Laura becomes the embodiment of everything he wants but can't have. She's privileged, she's beautiful, she's classed. This leads him to some poor decisions. He ends up getting involved with the local mob, or as it's referred to at this point in the show, the organization. He gets involved in organized crime. He's set up as the manager of a disco. The disco becomes the hot spot in town. Really great scenes filmed at the disco until we get to the one really, really not fun scene in the disco. So Luke kind of has this idea, I think, that he's going to kind of use the mob to get rich, and he thinks he's smart enough to be able to kind of stay one step ahead of them. This all comes to a head for him when the mob gives him an assignment that will most definitely end in his death. This is where we get into the controversial event in this relationship. What happens at this point in the story is that Luke realizes that the mob has outsmarted him. Their plan is basically to murder him. He's absorbing this news. He gets really drunk and desperate, and he's in this very screwed up state of mind. It's late at night. He and Laura are alone in the disco. She sees that he's upset. She tries to talk to him. She tries to comfort him. And he's really kind of out of his mind at this point. He's telling her to leave. She continues to try to talk to him. She can tell he's in some kind of trouble. Thinking that he's going to die, Luke confesses his obsession to Laura. He forces her onto the dance floor and rapes her. And going back and watching this scene again, it's very clear that this was a rape. It is absolutely 100% a rape scene. There's nothing ambiguous about the way it's filmed. It was surprising that this was something that had aired in the late 70s on daytime network TV. It's a really riveting scene. It's hard to watch. This was supposed to be really kind of the end of the storyline. After the rape, Luke was going to be killed off and written off the show. He was really brought in to be more of a temporary antagonist in the Laura and Scotty relationship. And so when people were watching this in real time, this was a huge sucker punch. They did not see this coming. It almost makes it seem like the way that the show handled this was to immediately sweep it under the rug and reframe it as a seduction. And they make it sound like that happened right away. But it didn't. I think in the initial aftermath of the rape, before they had decided to keep Luke on, is really pretty respectfully done to try to understand how this happened and why this became a storyline. The show was really surprised to learn that Luke had, against the odds, really resonated with audiences. Even with that storyline, he brought a more method acting sensibility. And this was very different for men in soap operas. If you kind of remember, especially on General Hospital, the male leads up to this point had been these kind of traditional matinee-looking actors playing doctors who had this very kind of stilted, old-timey acting style. So when the show saw the mass popularity for this character, they decided to change gears and sort of shift the storyline around. The audiences, despite this terrible turn with the story, but they wanted for the writers to somehow redeem this storyline to make it possible for them to be together, which just sounds so strange. The show was on the verge of being canceled, and then due to this storyline, it was taking off and becoming red hot. People were fascinated by these characters, and the audience started growing. It went from being kind of this dying dinosaur that was on its last leg to something really hot and trendy and contemporary. And that was a really crazy feat to have pulled off.
But gee, boss, do I have to?
When you go back and you read about this now, this wasn't just popular within the realm of soap watchers. This began to extend. Young audiences in particular really embraced these characters. College students basing their class schedule around when General Hospital was airing, dorm parties and viewings of the show. And it was absolutely becoming a legitimate cultural phenomenon. It was a real lightning in a bottle moment. Nothing like that had ever happened before, and nothing like that will ever happen again in soaps. And it happened because audiences responded so strongly to the chemistry between these two actors. I think that what made it different, uncomfortable for some people, it equally shows the traumatic effect of the rape on Luke. He's presented as remorseful. He's presented as devastated. He's presented as self-loathing and traumatized by the event as well. Tony Geary, in a later interview when talking about that, said the side of the rapist isn't necessarily the story that anyone wants to tell. It's a very heavy storyline. Laura's trauma is well explored. The fact that her attacker was somebody that she had known and trusted, and she had conflict about naming him as her attacker, so she doesn't. But it's made very clear that what happened to her was a rape, and it's discussed a lot. There's a very long story arc that deals with the implications of an aftermath, more so than I think maybe people remember. Basically, at this point, the writers decided to backpedal the storyline. It's a long, slow arc. So with that, we see the Luke character expanding some, beginning to shift and be written in a different way. What really surprised me about going back and watching some of these early plot lines was how not funny Luke was. When Luke was kind of rewritten to be less dark and a little more comedic, you really get to see how light and funny he can be as an actor. But you don't see that in the early storylines. In fact, it was kind of surprising to me to see a Luke who was so intense and grim and humorless. The character did begin to slowly shift and morph, but it somehow worked. Another thing about that is that I think that as the character and the story became more popular and audiences began to grow, there were a lot of people who tuned in at a point in the storyline where the rape was no longer being discussed. And so they didn't really know. I think the show benefited from that. The show reframed it as a seduction. It kind of became the official stance that this had actually been a seduction. They have this long, slow storyline where there's a slow redemption for Luke. So we see him slowly becoming a more sympathetic character. And a lot of this has to do with the sacrifices he's willing to make for Laura. We also see that through that life choice, he's in a position to finally have everything that the character originally was wanting, money and status and power, but it not meaning anything to him because the only thing he really values is Laura. However, he recognizes that he has hurt her and violated her, and for these reasons he can't have her. His way of trying to make it up to her is to kind of sacrifice the rest of his life to protect her. So eventually, things happen, and that's when the storyline begins to change. I look at the point where the characters go on the run together as being really kind of the hard reset for the story. At that point, the rape isn't talked about anymore. The rape goes from being a huge plot point that's discussed for 9 months to just kind of fizzling out and being left in the dust. The tone shifts wildly, and it becomes a screwball comedy, with these two young lovers on the run going through these kind of quirky adventure. And that's about the point in time. It was just picking it up at this point. You wouldn't have any idea that the other stuff had happened. I don't think that all the people who were fans of this storyline lost their minds and thought rape was romantic. I think they were more responding to the emotional beats in the story. The plot was a little bit more negotiable for them. This all really culminated in this iconic story with the two actors on the run. This is where you really get to see the chemistry between the actors, the banter, the way they sparkle together. It's just such a great pairing of actors and characters. Both of them morph very seamlessly from this kind of dark and heavy storyline into this very light humor. There was a really hard reset for Luke. He was always a little bit of an iconoclast and a rebel at heart who kind of lived his life based off of a sense of moral relativism, but he was played as more unconventional, more quirky, less dark, and definitely more romantic. He wasn't classic soap leading man material by any stretch of the imagination. Somehow, a guy who played this awful character, this character who did this really heinous, awful thing, was able to become America's sweetheart. The show was focusing on them so much that they were being worked to death. When they weren't working, they were doing promotional things. They were on such a streak. The publicity that they had to do for the show was enormous. They really didn't have free time. It was overwhelming. They both acknowledged having escaped in drug use. When people talk about the General Hospital set at that time, that was a very prevalent thing. According to what most people say, the drug use was rampant, and Gloria Monty, the producer, in some ways, is even said to have encouraged it. She felt like it led to better performances. She kind of liked that sort of loose, raucous atmosphere. She felt like that led to more creativity. It added to the energy of the acting performances, So when people talk about it, it does sound like it was a pretty off-the-chain time. For Genie in particular, she gives a very poignant interview in a Lifetime intimate portrait in the 90s that's available on YouTube, where she opens up a lot about her life during this time. She began using drugs with the older cast members on the set as a way of fitting in. It became a real problem for her for a while. Although it's every actor's dream to have that level of fame, in some ways I think there was a sense for both of them that it was too much of a good thing. It was something that they were going to forever be identified with. They couldn't really break out of it and get other parts. And I think they sometimes felt like they had a hard time being taken seriously as actors because of it. As the love story became more popular, Gloria Monty came up with some more creative curveballs. That moved into the Ice Princess storyline, which, I can't even be. This was a kind of a science fiction, James Bond fantasy storyline that involved Luke and Laura saving the world from being frozen by a weather machine owned by a crazy madman. But it was really fun to go back and watch it, even though it flirts with silliness. It also was something that was so fresh and different and really shook up the soap medium. It was a real game changer. And honestly, that kind of became a predominant theme for soap operas through the 80s. Every soap opera throughout the 80s would have these fantasy adventure storylines shot on location, cartoon villains. I think when General Hospital did it with the Ice Princess, it was kind of fun and different. As the 80s wore on, and every soap opera was kind of doing these types of storylines on repeat, it got stale. I was pretty relieved in the early 90s when soaps really began to kind of return to more of a reality-based baseline. And I give Gloria Monty a lot of credit credit for that. She took audiences for a ride. She asked them to accept a lot, but the payoff was there. She really was groundbreaking and really stretching the limits of the genre and taking people to new and unexpected places. And it's easy to understand in that regard why General Hospital was so riveting for people back then. Audiences never really knew where they were going to go. One of the really fun things also about going back and watching these vintage General Hospital episodes are just a number of familiar faces that pop up. Demi Moore, John Stamos, Rick Springfield, Richard D. Anderson. But there's so many people that I forgot were on the show at one point, and it's really interesting to see them pop up here. It was at a moment where it had a level of popularity to be a real launching pad for young actors. And the other thing about it was that it attracted veteran actors as well, which takes us to Luke and Laura's wedding. The show was not yet ready to give them their happy ending yet. The show had a really winning formula. They weren't quite ready to give that up and put them together permanently. However, this changed when a very famous fan of the show contacted the show's producers to share that she wanted to make an appearance on the show. This was none other than Miss Elizabeth Taylor. At this point, Elizabeth was married to Senator John Warner and living on a farm in Virginia. She was a little bored out of the limelight, and so she became hooked on General Hospital and became a huge fan of Luke and Laura. And when she read that the show wasn't planning to have them get married just yet, she wasn't happy about that. So she contacted the show to offer to do an appearance on the caveat that it would have to be at Luke and Laura's wedding. At this point, although the show didn't have plans to marry them just yet, they decided that this was too much of an honor, too big of a publicity stunt to deny. So they scrambled to put the wedding together. Luke and Laura's wedding was a massive television event, ginormous, 30 million viewers. It was really a pop culture moment. It was huge. And Liz Taylor did make a cameo as Helena Cassadine, widow of Nikos Cassadine, the crazy madman that Luke and Laura had defeated during the Ice Princess saga, who came to town to put a curse on them at their wedding in retribution for her husband's death. Now, Liz Taylor appearing on this show was a really iconic moment. And she wasn't the only celebrity to do so. Some other Hollywood veterans like Sammy Davis Jr. and Milton Berle also made appearances on the show. So at this point, the show was just on fire. Genie Francis decided to leave the show. She was having problems with drug use. She ended up in the hospital. The show demanded that she come back to work right away. The day that she returned to work, an assistant for the show came in her dressing room and essentially told her that it didn't matter if she lived or died, because Anthony Geary was the whole show. According to me, understandably, this was very upsetting. And this was also a time when she was beginning to really recognize that she needed to try to get a hold of herself, that her life was really spiraling out of control. If that's how the show feels, then I'm going to leave. Possibly a decision that saved her life. Walking away from something so enormously popular at the peak of its fame, inevitably there were going to be regrets. They created a really kind of nonsensical storyline where Laura's hypnotized and disappears in a fog, and it turns out she's hypnotized by this guy who really thinks she's somebody else, and he puts her on a boat. It goes out to sea, and she's presumed dead. There was some convoluted explanation for why he did this. I don't know. I honestly didn't watch it in its entirety. But I watched a little bit of it, and then I skipped ahead to Laura's return. In 1983, Tony Geary's contract was up, so he was ready to leave the show himself. Genie returned as Laura to tie up his storyline after being held prisoner on the Cassadine Island for the past 2 years. She and Luke are reunited, and the last we see of them, they are riding off in the sunset together. They're ready to see the world and have a life of adventure. We see them again a year later, where they returned for a very brief story arc. So the last moment that we see of them is Laura telling Luke that she's pregnant. They're both elated. It really ends up on a happy note. So that's kind of the last glimpse we get of them for a long time. Just one last thing about Laura's return. I do remember being a kid and watching the scenes where she comes back into town after school on a little black and white TV with rabbit ears. And the scene where he's on the balcony of the mayor's mansion, and he looks down and he sees Laura and he calls out, he goes running down. The reunion scene where they fall into each other's arms, it gets so epic and gothic and romantic. And it's just good stuff. I got swept away in it. I mean, that was just the kind of melodramatic, romantic thing that I would have gotten really swept up in when I was a kid. But Watching it again, that magic was still there for me. So when Tony Geary officially left the show in 1983, seemingly the world would have really been his oyster. He was enormously popular. He really was a mainstream celebrity at that point. Despite his talent and his popularity and the fact that he certainly had the chops to do a lot of things, the opportunities just didn't follow him. He could not break away from Luke. He left the show with high hopes. He really wanted to evolve as an actor, to grow past Luke. He had given himself a certain time frame. He felt like if after a certain time things hadn't come together, then he would go back to daytime. He did eventually end up returning to daytime. So Genie also took various roles. She was temporarily on a nighttime soap called Bare Essence. She was in the North and South miniseries. She married Star Trek actor Jonathan Frakes, who she's been married to for many years at this point. They seem to really have a great relationship. Genie eventually ended up returning to daytime first. She took a role on the soap opera Days of Our Lives. The show wanted her name for the bragging rights, but they couldn't really bother to come up with any real material for her. Later, she took the role of Sarah Connor on All My Children. So Sarah was a little different from Laura. She's kind of a gold digger. She kind of started out on one note, but she ended up as more of a heroine. Seems like she was pretty happy and content on All My Children. After Tony and Genie left General Hospital, Gloria Monty continued on until 1987. Following her departure, the show hit a real creative slump and the ratings started to plummet. I think this might have been around the time of the Casey the Alien period, which was, as silly as it sounds. In an attempt to kind of revitalize the show, Gloria Monty was brought back in 1991 in hopes that she could work her magic again. She didn't. She couldn't repeat the magic, and the show really tanked under her tenure. One of the real significant things that she did was to lure Tony Geary to come back to the show. He did not want to play Luke. He was willing to give General Hospital another crack under the condition that he did not have to play Luke again, and he could play somebody as different from Luke as they could possibly write. He also says that Gloria Monty was on board with that. She agreed. She didn't think that they should try to repeat the magic with Luke. So instead, Gloria wrote this character named Bill Eckert for Tony to play. I feel like he was one of those characters that soap opera writers are always trying to make happen in some ways, and they never really take. Sometimes the writers will bring a character in and kind of shove them down the audience's throats in an attempt to get them to accept them. And for whatever reason, it just doesn't work, And it's often, in this case, not a reflection of the talent of the actor. And it probably didn't help that the audience really only wanted to see him as Luke. I think Bill would have had to have been really amazing to work for audiences. Gloria Monty was fired, and in 1992, a new producer, Wendy Rich, was brought in. Now, around this time, General Hospital also changed head writers. This was a decision that would really significantly impact the early to mid-90s era of General Hospital. They brought in a lady named Claire Labine, who was pretty much a daytime legend at this point. She had written for many shows, most significantly Ryan's Hope, and Claire Labine had kind of a distinctive trademark style of writing, very warm, very intelligent, very character-driven, thoughtful, and also having a penchant for tackling social issues. Claire Labine was a pretty big coup for the show as a writer. Under the helm of Wendy Rich, with Claire Labine at the writing helm, General Hospital entered a real renaissance period. These changes represented a shift away from kind of the over-the-top fantasy storylines into work that was more character-driven, more grounded. Certain aspects of her writing and certain storylines really are very exquisite. She had a way of kind of fleshing characters out. Even characters who had been on the show for a long time, new sides of the actors. It really gave a new appreciation for what these actors could do. I'm a fan of the Claire Labine period. Not everybody is. It's kind of a return to a different kind of soap telling, but at this point, when General Hospital was being revamped, basically the showrunners decided that the Bill Eckert character wasn't working. He had to go. They wanted to bring back Luke. When they presented this to Anthony Geary, his caveat was that he would only do it if Laura would return with him. He didn't feel like it would go over well with the audiences to just bring Luke back. So at this point, Genie Francis was happy with her role in All My Children. She had been told she had security there. She really didn't want to leave. Essentially, they fired her without warning, told her that they were going to kill her All My Children character off, but that if she wanted to work for the network, she could come back as Laura. the decision was made to kill off Bill Ecker to clear the way to bring back Luke and Laura, which at the time was a really big deal. They'd been gone for about 10 years. So the characters returned with their 10-year-old son Lucky in October of 1993. I'm really partial to the early 90s Luke and Laura return period. A lot of care was put into their return. And one of the best things about it was the addition of their son Lucky. Honestly, with a few exceptions here and there, most of the time soap kids are rarely seen, especially when they reach the age that Lucky was at the time of the return. The character was 10. That's kind of like a boring age for soap kids, kind of with the tropes of soap opera children. You might see them a little bit when they're young. There might be some kind of dramatic storyline around them when they're a baby or a toddler. They get sick, they get kidnapped, there's some drama around them, and then they kind of disappear for a few years. They pull them out every once in a while. They're on the holiday episodes. But you'll last see them at like 10, 11, 12, until it's decided that it's time to rapidly age them. Writers decide that they need a new crop of teen characters to come in for summer storylines, and so they rapidly will age them to like 16, and then they become a main character. 10 is not usually really an age where a soap kid's going to get a lot of material. But going back and watching these scenes, I was just reminded of what a find 11-year-old Jonathan Jackson was as Lucky. So it really kind of goes from being the popularity of the duo, Luke and Laura, to now the trio of Luke, Laura, and Lucky. The audience just really embraced him immediately. The on-screen relationship between he and his parents was just so lived in and naturalistic. You could really believe that they were a family. They did a really good job of kind of funneling their personality traits into Lucky. You could kind of see the influence of both parents. He was really exactly the child that you would expect these two characters to produce. So he left the character of Lucky as a teenager in the late 90s to pursue other acting work. But he has returned as Lucky at various points. But going back to this, the early 90s, to me this was just a great period. I think the show was very balanced at that point. There was drama, there was humor, there's a lot of warmth in the writing, and I missed that time of the show. Not everybody did, though, namely Anthony Geary. Around this point in the story, we kind of get into what I almost look at as the deconstruction period for Luke and Laura. I don't know. So Luke, Laura, and Lucky were brought back in the early 90s. They added baby Lulu to their family. He was very unhappy during these years. He didn't like this interpretation of Luke. He found him to be too sanitized, too watered down. He complains about having to kind of do the cutesy parent scenes and the fact that Luke was written as a good dad. And they're just so good together. They've got this great chemistry. They're very believable. There is some stuff, like a side plot about their dog, Foster, that gets like a little hokey. And Anthony Geary has complained about having to do scenes with the dog. I think in some ways they were trying to come up with age-appropriate material for Jonathan Jackson. Being that Lucky was only 10, he wasn't really old enough for more of the teen storylines. The rough edges had been smoothed out. And I felt like what they did was kind of a good natural extension of where Luke would be at this point in his life. And it wasn't all sunshine and roses. During that time, Luke murdered at least 2 people I can think of and rejoined and betrayed the mob. And, he wasn't exactly So moving into the early 90s period, during the return of Luke and Laura's storyline, it always really makes me sad to hear Tony Geary's recollections of this time. There's a real dissonance for me with what I see on the screen, going back and watching that era of the show, versus the internal experience that he says he was having during the time. I think it was just great acting from Tony Geary. The Labine era actually only lasted about 2 years. It began around 1993 and wrapped up in January of 1996. And I think it's worth noting that during that time, the time between the fall of 1993, when Luke and Laura returned, and early January of 1996, when Claire Labine left the show, something happened during that time that is often considered to be the downfall of the soap. After having had a strong hold in the 80s, the mid-90s really represented a transitional point for soap operas. And in the opinion of a lot of people, this is when they really started to decline. Not because the quality declined, but because of something that happened during that time frame that drastically impacted daytime television viewing. This, of course, being the trial of O.J. Simpson. That kind of in-depth coverage of a trial was just not something that we saw very often. As anybody who was around during that time time remembers, people were absolutely riveted by this trial. In a sense, it really became a soap opera of its own. Different characters and storylines and plot twists. A lot of us were really on the edge of our seat watching this. I certainly was, falling further and further behind on my soap operas because they were preempted. They were preempted so often to make room for coverage of the trial that it was really hard to keep up with the ongoing storylines. It kind of whet people's appetite for more of that kind of true life crime, reality-based programming. And we really see that playing out in contemporary media. Reality TV shows have really replaced a lot of the network programming that a lot of us grew up watching. The O.J. Simpson trial really ushered in court TV, the 24-hour news cycle, interest in true life crime. It represented a new Fast and Furious kind of media. Perhaps maybe soap operas began to look a little antiquated next to that. Because of the numerous preemptions during the O.J. trials, soap opera ratings really declined. There was a mad scramble to change writers and producers to try to get the ratings back up. It was a time of a lot of panic and chaos in the soap opera world. They just simply lost viewers during the trial. Trying to keep up with the schedule of when soap operas were going to be preempted and when they would air was really difficult as a viewer. My soap opera viewing definitely trailed off during this time. Turning on the TV, having the trial be on, kind of getting sucked into that. And like a lot of soap viewers during that time, I had missed so much time with these ongoing storylines and was so behind on the plots that I did stop watching for a few years. I did return to the fold, probably somewhere around the summer of 1996. So it wasn't a very long time that I wasn't watching, but it was definitely enough time to have drastically changed. And one of the changes was Claire Labine no longer being the head writer of General Hospital. So what we often hear from Tony Geary about this is that he was absolutely miserable during these Claire Labine years, and that they had multiple conversations where they talked about differences of opinion for the direction of the Luke and Laura characters. What Tony Geary said in an interview is that Claire Labine at one point basically said something to him to the effect of, I just don't really like your character. I don't think he's a very nice person. I have a really difficult time writing for him. And he describes having been really taken aback by this, but he said that he made a decision that he was going to give it 2 years and then make a decision from there on whether or not he wanted to stay with the show. He also says that at the end of that 2-year period, he was absolutely prepared to leave, both because he was disenchanted for the writing of his character and also because during that time he had purchased a home in Amsterdam, an area that he was very, very happy in. He would have been perfectly happy to retire to Amsterdam and give up his work on General Hospital altogether. However, the show was not prepared to let him go. Around this time, Claire Labine did end up leaving General Hospital. She actually was in the process of developing a new soap opera for ABC. However, the plans for that didn't pan out. She eventually ended up returning for a very ill-fated stint on One Life to Live to finish out her contract. ABC agreed to what is probably the best deal ever inked in daytime television history. By his own words, he was already kind of at the top tier of what the show was able to pay him. So not being able to offer more financially, instead they agreed to compensate him with time off. Quite famously, he arranged a contract with ABC where he only had to work for 6 months of the year and got to spend the other 6 months in Amsterdam. Additionally, he was given more creative control and input over his character. Some creative control over his character was probably something that he always had. By his own admission, pretty much from the jump with the character of Luke, he had begun to rewrite dialogue, improvise, ad-lib, and this is something that is well documented both by him and the other actors on the show. It was pretty much a trademark of his. I think for avid viewers who have watched him play Luke through the years, you can tell when he's ad-libbing. He has a very specific kind of sardonic, dry wit. And I think that the ad-libs are kind of one of those great features that give Luke some of his flavor, some of his uniqueness. He also very, very frequently rewrote his dialogue. In fact, in one interview he says that whenever he was given a script, the first thing that he did was to kind of pull out a pen and go through it and rewrite everything he didn't like, things that he thought sounded cliche. It was very important to him, I think, that Luke always be different, kind of have this subversive edge to him. And I do really believe that those contributions that he made to the character were really part of what made Luke so special. However, as he gained more control of this character, the more Luke changed, and these weren't necessarily changes that were embraced by fans. One of the things that Tony was very vocal about in interviews was that he really wanted to explore the dark side of Luke more. And so by his own admission, he was bored playing what he felt was such a watered-down version of the character. I do think, in all fairness to the writers, that a lot of this was a reflection of the extreme popularity of Anthony Geary. I think that shaped a lot of how Luke was written during that time. I also think that in a lot of ways, he was the hero of the show, that the showrunners did kind of consider him the hero of the show. I think that they really attributed the show's success to him, and also the salvation of the show. And if Luke and Laura hadn't popped off and become so popular, this was a show that was likely going to be canceled. I actually think that the Claire Labine team did a pretty good job, but, from what he has said, he was unhappy and wanted to change the direction of his character. Sadly, for fans of Luke and Laura, this didn't just mean that the character of Luke began to take some dark turns, but it also meant the breakup of the relationship between this iconic super couple. He also talked pretty honestly about wanting to rip the albatross of Luke and Laura off and be able to play Luke on his own. It sounds like at that point he felt like he'd rather they break the characters up and shake their storylines up a little bit. And understandably, this was not popular with fans of the couple. They did have them reunite at one point. It wasn't a permanent reunion. But I think even the fact that they tried was gratifying to those of us as viewers who really felt that it was a mistake to break them up in the first place. And honestly, I do understand that soap operas are meant to have drama, and drama comes from tension and conflict, and it probably is hard to do that with a long-term happy couple. But I think for a lot of us, Luke and Laura were kind of the exception. It kind of felt like a slap in the face, and I think that this was furthered along by some of the interviews given by Mr. Geary. For example, in one, he compared fans who were upset over the divorce of Luke and Laura to children who couldn't get over their parents' divorce, which, as a fan of this couple, I remember reading that for the first time years ago and feeling like it was a little patronizing. A lot of times in these interviews, the tone that came across was that the places that he had taken the storyline and the changes that he had enacted in Luke were superior, and perhaps maybe fans just couldn't understand it. He always seemed to be happy playing Luke that way. I think it was more enjoyable for him to play the character that way than it was for me in the audience to watch the character played that way. Luke got dark. I mean, it wasn't just that they wanted to kind of explore the complexity of his personality or gave him some dark undertones or explored some dark impulses in the character. Now, all of that I'd be on board with, but it kind of became a show me, don't tell me thing. I felt like a lot of times when I was reading these interviews, I was being told how much better this Luke was, but I wasn't necessarily seeing that on the screen. In fact, the darker they pushed the character, the more indulgent it started to seem. And I say this as somebody who adores Tony Geary as an actor, but there were times when that take on Luke started to feel over the top, bordering on campy at times, and sometimes just downright hammy. Luke began to become so self-indulgent about his dark side that became the whole character. And in the process of doing that to the character, they also really retconned a lot of things that we had already seen on screen and knew weren't that way. It was rewritten that Luke had always been a terrible deadbeat dad and a shitty husband and cheated on Laura and had this, love child with someone else, Holly. None of this stuff fit what we had seen. It's one thing to decide to take the character down a certain path, but it's another thing to then go back and try to shoehorn all this history. It was a lot to swallow. Even with breaking up the characters, had they done this in a way where they had a good storyline for it, and it was authentic, and they sold it, even if it was heart-wrenching, I really could have gone there. I love these actors. They could have sold it. I would have been willing to take that ride. But really, the way that they wrote their divorce, it just seemed so gratuitous and frankly unconvincing. Out of nowhere, they just took all the warmth out of these characters in their relationship and turned it into something really brittle and tense and didn't really feel convincing. I think that was a hard pill for the audience to swallow. It never quite felt right for Luke and Laura. Now, that said, there was definitely a point where I was perfectly happy to have them remain divorced. Mostly just because they had made such a wreck of their storyline. I didn't want to see it in this kind of compromised form. Luke became so unlikable. It was really hard to root for Laura to get back together with him. And I think for me, one of the saddest aspects of this was the toll it took on the writing for Laura's character. I didn't feel that the writing team at that time really knew how to write for her as an adult woman. Constantly written as a victim, constantly having everybody dump on her, constantly weak and unhappy. Everything that we loved about Laura, her resourcefulness, her backbone, her feistiness, her cleverness, her intelligence, all these great characteristics that she had just kind of went out the window. It's like the show was just really abusing her. And it was such an unpleasant thing to watch for such a beloved character. It also didn't do Jean any favors. She deserved better. And I wasn't very surprised when she chose to leave the show again. Much like the first time she left, this was another situation where she felt undervalued by the writers. She had asked to take a summer off. She had done this before. It had never really been an issue. This was also in conjunction with when Tony Geary was going to have his annual time off. They denied it. She was very frustrated and hurt by this. And, she was always very clear that she didn't resent Tony Geary over this. She didn't blame him. He was actually very supportive of them having equal treatment. But to her, she felt like this was once again her getting second-rate treatment. She was frustrated by it. Given the really weak material that they had been giving her for a long time, I couldn't really blame her. Now, in order to facilitate that exit, the show came up with kind of a weird and convoluted and, again, seriously retconned storyline that involved Laura having committed a murder and going into some kind of catatonic state when she remembered it that ended up having her institutionalized. So that was why she left. Not one of my favorite storylines. They revived Laura's character briefly a little while later to commemorate the 25th anniversary of the wedding of Luke and Laura. They had kind of an awakenings type storyline where Laura briefly came out of her coma and returned home to an unknown to her fake second marriage with Luke. The storyline was actually pretty popular. Genie did win a long overdue Emmy for her work on it. It was a brief stint. Laura was back for about a month. Brought her back to drive ratings up and milk what they could out of the 25th anniversary, but didn't offer her a return to the show. So Genie was again off the show for a long time. Was brought back to facilitate Tony Geary's exit from the show when he finally retired. Many, many people hoped that this would mean a final reunion for the characters. The hope, naturally, was that the two would reunite and kind of ride off into the sunset together. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, which was another instance of Tony Geary being very vocal in the press that was not the ending that he wanted for the characters. In fact, they were not even given a final goodbye scene. Luke's exit storyline, very convoluted. Yeah, too much to get into. Pretty dark, including recovering a memory of murdering both of his parents and developing split personality disorder as a result. He finally left the show in case of art imitating life to go to Amsterdam and try to find himself and find some peace of mind. And the last we see of he and Laura is Laura finding a letter that he's written her after he's left town. So no goodbye scene between the two of them, no real closure. Just kind of disappointing. That was Tony Geary's wish. He was adamant, although he knew that fans really wanted that reunion between the two characters. It just wasn't where he saw the character going. In fact, his original idea was to have Luke kill himself. Thankfully, the writers didn't approve that. It really speaks to an actor's ownership of his character. There was obviously, I think, a huge disconnect between what the audiences wanted from that character, what the audiences had come to love about that character, and the way that the actor wanted to play him. Tony Geary kind of operated from a place that he had created this character, and he felt so closely connected to him that he wanted to maintain a certain authenticity with the character. In Luke's younger days, he was the original anti-hero on the show, so he was the character with all the edge, and that it was disconcerting for him to come back older when there were all these other younger actors at this point playing those kinds of more edgy characters. I think he felt in some ways like he had kind of originated that trope, and it bothered him to be put out to pasture. In fact, he talks about how during that period of the show, there was essentially a stable of anti-heroes with Luke kind of being the dullest of all of them. There was a danger of them kind of ending up becoming more side characters. He felt the need to fight against that. It's also just very interesting to look at both Genie and Tony's relationship with these characters. When you hear them talk about their characters, they really speak like true artists about their characters. But on the other hand, their success was a double-edged sword. I think it was something that pigeonholed them. I think there was a sense for both of them that it prevented them from really being able to grow and have the kind of careers and industry respect that they wanted to have, that they longed for. In reference to fans' unhappiness with the direction that Luke ended up going in, Tony also stated in an interview that at the end of the day, he felt that the only thing he owed the audience was a good performance. Genie Francis kind of got the short end of the stick. The changes that maybe were made to their storylines in order to facilitate Tony Geary's desires for his character negatively impacted the writing for her character. And so they ended up wasting her. It seemed almost like the show was kind of reveling in deconstructing these characters. Part of that actually involved revisiting the rape story in the late 90s. The rape hadn't been mentioned in years. So going back and revisiting all of this, it was really surprising to me how vested in it I still was for something that I really hadn't thought about. Still having nostalgic love for these characters is not the same as endorsing every aspect of the storyline. I also think that things from the past that reflect values that are in conflict with the ones that we may have today shouldn't be dismissed wholesale. I think it is okay to call out art from the past while still judging it from the lens of its own time. Another thing that I think is really impressive about Gloria Monty and her era on General Hospital was how skilled she was for that moment in time at kind of latching onto the zeitgeist. One of the examples of this was the addition of Richard Simmons as a regular character on the show, playing himself, teaching an exercise class at the campus disco. He did this for years, and this wasn't just like he came once and had a walk-on part or a cameo kind of thing. He was actually on the canvas, written into the show. One of his really popular early storylines involved him helping an overweight girl named Deb in his exercise class lose weight and kind of start this health journey. That was the storyline that really resonated with fans. Definitely a fan favorite on the show. And just going back and watching these, he has such a warmth. He has such a natural warmth and charisma that really comes through. He was beginning to gain attention for his appearances on talk shows and game shows. Gloria Monty saw the potential here and him being somebody who could work well on the show. She was right. He was a very popular addition to the show. I think she also kind of recognized that there was something about the emerging fitness craze that was bound to kind of take off, that was kind of had its finger on the pulse and was bound to become more popular. I think it was very prescient of her to latch onto that, recognize the potential for Richard Simmons on the show. It's so great that you can still find these episodes and his role in the show is preserved and able to be watched. And quite sadly, while I was in the middle of working on this video, Richard passed away. I did just want to take a moment out from this to honor his memory and his work on General Hospital. These were characters who genuinely brought a lot of joy to a lot of people, and I remain one of the grateful members of that audience. Thank you so much for watching and bearing with me on this. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time.
I can't work under these conditions.
It doesn't have to end here. Click on one of the videos below for Elvis and more. And we'd love to have you like, share, and subscribe. And maybe even join.
So we can put some more gas in this thing.